The woman nobody saw. The morning sun was still hidden behind a blanket of clouds. The street outside was quiet except for the soft hum of passing cars in the big house at the corner. Footsteps moved slowly from room to room, carrying the faint sound of a broom brushing against the floor. It was just another day for her. She had been working in this house for almost 3 years. Yet she felt like a ghost drifting through someone else's life. People saw her, but they didn't see her. Her name was Amira, though most in the house didn't bother to use it. To them, she was simply the maid. Amira never complained. She arrived early each morning, often before the family even woke. She would set the kettle on the stove, straighten the cushions in the living room, and open the curtains to let in whatever light the day had to offer. Her movements were quiet, practiced, and careful. The house came alive with voices. But none of them were meant for her. When the family had breakfast, Amira would pass by with a pot of coffee, refilling cups before they were empty. Sometimes she'd greet them softly, "Good morning," and get nothing more than a distracted nod. It wasn't that they were unkind. They were simply busy, caught up in their own worlds, and in that world. She was part of the background. Like a chair or a painting on the wall, visitors came. Often business partners in expensive suits, friends with warm laughter, relatives with sharp eyes. Amira would glide among them with trays of food or glasses of water. She was close enough to hear their conversations, yet distant enough that no one asked her opinion. Her presence was expected but unnoticed. It was as if she wore an invisible cloak, one she had learned never to take off. Still, there were moments when she felt the weight of it. Moments when she wished someone would look her in the eye and ask how she was doing, but wishes like that were dangerous. They only made her heart ache. So she pushed them down and kept moving. When she finished dusting the shelves in the study, she lingered for a second by the window outside. The garden was wet from last night's rain. The smell of damp earth reminded her of the small village she once called home. Back then, she wasn't invisible. She used to sing during gatherings. Her voice carrying across the fields, people would stop and listen, smiling. But that was another life, one she had folded away and hidden deep inside. Later that morning, as she wiped the dining table, voices drifted in from the hallway too. Of the family members were talking in low tones. She canceled. One said, sounding frustrated, "The charity event is tomorrow and now we have no singer. We'll just hire someone else." The other replied, "It's too late." "Everyone's booked," came the answer, followed by the sound of footsteps walking away. Amira stayed still for a moment, her cloth resting on the table. A thought pressed against her mind. She could sing. She could fill that room with music they wouldn't forget. But just as quickly, she pushed it away. It wasn't her place to offer. Her voice belonged to a part of her life that no one here would ever know. As she moved to the living room, she passed the youngest child of the house sitting cross-legged. On the floor with a sketchbook, the child looked up, a smile tugging at their lips. "You're humming again," the little one said. Amira froze, not realizing she had been it. "Makes the work easier," she replied softly. "You sound nice," the child said simply. Then returned to their drawing. The words lingered in Amira's mind like a soft echo. The rest of the day passed in the same rhythm, cleaning, organizing. Keeping herself in the background, she avoided mirrors, not wanting to be reminded of how plain she looked in her faded uniform. Dad. She couldn't shake the thought of the canceled singer. She imagined standing in front of a crowd again, her voice carrying a story the way it once did. And then she imagined the laughter, the surprise on their faces if she dared to speak up. No, she told herself. It was better to stay invisible. When evening came, the house grew quiet again. She packed her things and stepped out into the cool air. Streetlights flickered on, casting pools of yellow light on the wet pavement. Her small apartment was only a short walk away, but tonight she walked slower, her thoughts heavy. Inside, she poured herself a cup of tea and sat by the window from here. She could see the city lights blinking in the distance. She thought about the day, the conversation she overheard, the child's comment, the ember of her old self that had stirred for a moment. She whispered something she hadn't said in years. Maybe one day, they'll hear me. The words felt strange, like they belonged to a braver version of herself. But as she sat there, listening to the faint sound of rain starting again, She didn't take them back, because even though she was the woman nobody saw, somewhere deep inside, she was beginning to believe that might not always be true. A glimpse of something more the next morning began like all the others. Amira arrived early, her coat damp from the misty air outside. She moved through the quiet halls, setting the kettle on the stove, arranging the breakfast table, and checking that the flowers in the vases still looked fresh. Everything was routine, familiar, safe, predictable. But somewhere in the back of her mind, yesterday's conversation still played over and over, the canceled singer, the worried voices, the thought that had crept in and refused to leave. It was a thought she didn't dare entertain for long, yet it stayed, like a small, persistent knock on a closed door. By the time the family gathered for breakfast, the house was buzzing with plans for the charity event. Guests would be coming from all over. The tables would be covered in white linen, the chandeliers polished until they sparkled. Everyone was excited, except for the small problem no one seemed to have solved: who would sing? Amira moved quietly between them, pouring coffee, replacing bread rolls, and collecting empty plates. She noticed the slight tension in their voices. But she also noticed something else. No one was talking about hiring anyone anymore. It was as if they had decided to simply skip the performance later in the day. While dusting the shelves in the study, she heard footsteps behind her, turning slightly. She saw the youngest child of the house standing there, holding a crumpled piece of paper. "Can you help me with this?" the child asked, showing her a school project. It was a small poem, simple but sweet. The child asked if she could read it out loud. Amira smiled faintly and began to read, her voice soft at first. Halfway through, without thinking, she added a slight melody to the words. It wasn't singing exactly, just letting the lines flow like music. When she finished, the child's eyes were wide. "You made it sound nice," the child whispered. "You should do that at the event." Amira's heart gave a startled jump. "That's not for me," she replied quickly. "That's for the guests." "But you could," the child insisted. Amira shook her head and returned to her work. But the comment lingered like the faint scent of perfume after someone leaves a room that afternoon. While polishing the silver trays in the kitchen, she didn't realize she was humming again. Her voice grew a little louder as she got lost in the melody. She didn't know anyone was listening until she turned and saw the lady of the house standing in the doorway. The woman's expression was unreadable. For a long second, neither of them spoke. Then the lady said, "I didn't know you could sing like that." Amira's hands tightened on the cloth she was holding. I don't," she said quietly. "It's just something I do when I'm alone." The lady tilted her head as if weighing something in her mind. "You know the event tomorrow?" "We still don't have a performer," she said slowly. "Maybe you could." Before she could finish, Amira stepped back, shaking her head. "No, ma'am. That's not for someone like me." The lady didn't press further, but her eyes stayed on Amira for a moment longer before she left the room. Amira stood there in the quiet kitchen, her heart beating faster than it should. The idea frightened her, standing in front of people, being looked at, judged. She had worked so hard to stay unseen. Why would she willingly step into the light? That night, after returning to her small apartment, she found herself pacing. Her hands rested on the windowsill as she looked out at the city lights. She remembered her younger days, the open fields back home, the way her voice used to carry. Under the stars, she remembered the smiles, the claps, the way people would close their eyes and listen. A part of her missed it. A part of her wanted to feel it again. But fear was a stubborn thing. It told her she didn't belong on any stage. It told her people would laugh, that her voice didn't matter, and for most of her life, she had believed it still. As she lay in bed that night, the child's words returned. "You should do that at the event." The lady's voice followed. "I didn't know you could sing like that." Two small sparks, flickering against the darkness. She didn't know it yet, but those sparks were about to set something in motion she could never have imagined. The next morning would bring an invitation she wouldn't be able to ignore. And for the first time in years, the woman nobody saw would have to decide if she was ready to be seen. The invitation the morning of the charity event arrived with a thin layer of fog hugging the streets. Amira walked to work with her hands tucked deep into her coat pockets. She could already imagine the house buzzing with activity, the clinking of dishes, the rush of footsteps, the constant hum of last-minute preparations. She was ready for a long day of quiet work, moving unseen between all the noise when she stepped inside. The scent of fresh flowers filled the hallway. Tall arrangements of lilies and roses stood in the corners, their petals glistening with drops of water in the dining room. White tablecloths hung neatly, the silverware shining like mirrors under the chandelier light. The family's voices floated through the rooms, sharp and quick, like pieces of a puzzle being snapped into place. As she headed toward the kitchen to start her duties, the lady of the house appeared in front of her. "Amira," she said, her voice calm but purposeful. "We need to talk." Amira froze for a moment, then nodded and followed her into the quieter study. The lady closed the door behind them. "Remember I told you we don't have a singer for tonight?" she began. Amira lowered her gaze, unsure where this was going. "I've been thinking," the lady continued. "I heard you yesterday in the kitchen, and I think you should sing." It was like the words floated in the air for a moment before they fully sank in. Amira blinked, shaking her head almost immediately. "No, ma'am, I couldn't." "I'm not. You are." The lady interrupted gently. "I don't think you realize how good you are." Amira's hands twisted together nervously. "People don't come to these events to hear someone like me," she said quietly. "They come to hear someone who can move them." The lady replied in "You can." Her heart was racing. She wanted to say no, to retreat back into the safety of invisibility, but the lady's eyes held no mockery, only a steady belief that unsettled her. "I wouldn't ask if I didn't think you could do it," she said. "Just one song, that's all." Amira hesitated. Her thoughts were a whirl. The fear of being judged, the possibility of making a mistake, the memory of voices from her past telling her to stay in her place. But another voice whispered inside her, "What if this is the moment you've been waiting for?" She found herself nodding before she fully realized it. "All right," she whispered, her voice almost too quiet to hear. The lady smiled. "We'll make sure you have a few minutes to prepare. Wear something you feel comfortable in. The rest will take care of itself." The day moved quickly. By late afternoon, the house had transformed. Candles flickered on every table, soft music played in the background, and guests began arriving in coats and polished shoes. Amira stayed in the kitchen for most of it, helping arrange trays of food, her stomach twisting tighter with each passing minute. She had chosen a simple dress she owned, one she rarely wore. It was nothing grand, but it was clean and neat, and when she caught her reflection in the kitchen window, she barely recognized herself. Her hair was brushed back, her face calm but pale. She looked almost like someone who belonged in the light when the moment finally came. The lady of the house found her near the pantry door. "It's time," she said softly. Amira's throat felt dry. Her feet felt heavy as she followed her toward the small stage set up in the corner of the main room. The guests were chatting, their glasses filled, their faces warm with laughter. They didn't notice her at first. She stood there, hands clasped in front of her, feeling the weight of every heartbeat. The lady stepped forward to speak into the microphone. "Before we begin the evening, I'd like to introduce someone very special to us," she said. "You may know her as the one who keeps our home running so beautifully. But tonight, you'll know her for something else." A few heads turned in Amira's direction. Curious, the lady continued, "Please, welcome, Amira." The room's sound softened. She stepped forward, the lights feeling brighter than they should. Her fingers trembled as she held the microphone. For a brief second, she thought about walking away. But then she remembered the child's words, the lady's belief. The ember in her chest that had been waiting for years. She closed her eyes, took a slow breath, and began to sing. The first note was gentle, almost uncertain, but as the melody unfolded, her voice grew steadier, richer, warmer. It filled the room like sunlight breaking through clouds. Conversation stopped, glasses stilled, and eyes turned toward her. Her song wasn't just music, it was a story, carrying pieces of her past, her struggles, her hope. By the time she reached the final note, the room was completely still, and in that silence, Amira realized something for the first time in years. She wasn't invisible, the first note for a heartbeat after her song ended. The room was frozen in silence. Amira's fingers were still wrapped around the microphone. Her breath soft and steady, she opened her eyes slowly, unsure of what she might see. And then it came a sound like a wave rolling through the air. Clapping, first scattered, then rising into a full swell. People were on their feet, smiling, nodding, some even wiping their eyes. The noise filled the room, but Amira's chest felt strangely quiet, as if her heart had paused to take it all in. She had not been laughed at. She had not been ignored. She had been heard. The lady of the house stepped up beside her, beaming. "I told you," she whispered. Before addressing the crowd, "Let's give her another round of applause," she said. And the sound came again, warm and genuine. Amira felt her cheeks flush, not from embarrassment, but from something she hadn't felt in years. Pride. She set the microphone back on its stand, her hands trembling as she stepped down from the stage. People reached out to stop her. "That was beautiful," one woman said, her voice sincere. "You have a gift," said another. Amira murmured thank yous, her voice barely audible, still stunned by the attention. In the kitchen, the staff had been peeking from the doorway. When she walked in, they grinned and clapped quietly among themselves. One of them patted her shoulder. "You've been hiding that voice from us all this time?" they teased gently. Amira smiled shyly, shaking her head. "It's just something I used to do," she replied, though deep down, she knew it was more than that. Back in the main room, the evening carried on, laughter, music, the clink of glasses. Yet now, when people looked her way, they didn't just see the maid, they saw her. A woman with a voice, a story, a presence they had overlooked for far too long. Throughout the night, small moments caught her off guard, a guest asking if she'd ever sung professionally, another suggesting she should perform at other events. Even the youngest child, with wide eyes and a proud grin, whispered, "I told you so." Later, when the guests began to leave, the lady of the house found her in the hallway. "You changed the atmosphere tonight," she said softly. "You made it. You're Maid." Amira didn't quite know what to say to that. She only knew that something inside her had shifted. The door she thought was locked forever had been nudged open when the last guest was gone. She stepped outside into the cool night air. The city felt different somehow. Brighter. More alive. She walked home slowly, her mind replaying the moment she had started to sing. She could still feel it in her chest, the way the first note had left her lips like a leap into the unknown. And how, instead of falling, she had found herself flying. The next morning, she half expected everything to go back to normal. She thought perhaps last night had been a fleeting moment, a small ripple that would fade by daylight. But when she arrived at the house, things were different. The guards at the gate greeted her warmly. The chef waved from the kitchen, and when she walked into the dining room, the family looked up and smiled. "How's our star?" One of them said playfully. Amira blinked, unsure how to respond. It was strange. The same walls, the same faces. Yet the way they looked at her had changed. She was no longer just a shadow moving through the background. The lady of the house poured her a cup of tea and set it in front of her. "You were extraordinary," she said. "We've already had calls from 2 guests asking if you'd be willing to sing at their events." Amira's eyes widened. "Me?" she asked, almost laughing. "Yes, you," the lady said. "Don't think you can slip back into invisibility now." That day, as she worked, she caught herself humming again. Only this time, she didn't stop. She let the notes float through the rooms. If someone heard, she didn't feel the urge to shrink away. She had been seen, and it hadn't broken her. It had changed her, and deep down, she knew the first note of last night had been more than the start of a song. It had been the start of something she wasn't ready to name yet, something that could take her far beyond the walls of this house. The reaction the days after the charity event felt different. It wasn't just in Amira's mind, the change was real. People who had walked past her without a glance now stopped to speak. The smiles she received were warmer, the conversations longer. It began the very next morning. As she polished the hallway mirror, a guest from the event arrived unexpectedly. The woman stepped inside carrying a small basket of flowers. "These are for you," she said, handing them to Amira. "That song. It stayed with me all week." Amira blinked, unsure how to respond. "Thank you," she whispered, her fingers brushing over the petals as if they might vanish. Word had spread faster than she imagined. The chef told her he'd overheard 2 guests at a cafe talking about the maid with the golden voice. Even the delivery man, who usually left packages without a word, grinned at her and said, "I heard about you in the evenings." When the house was quiet, Amira began to notice something inside herself shifting. She no longer walked with her shoulders hunched. Her steps had a quiet confidence, not loud, it's not showy, just enough to remind her that she had a place in the world. One afternoon, the lady of the house found her in the kitchen peeling fruit. "Do you remember the Roberts family from the event?" she asked. Amira nodded. "They're hosting a dinner next week," the lady continued. "They'd like you to perform. Only if you're comfortable, of course." The words made Amira's chest tighten. Another performance. In front of strangers again? Her first instinct was to say no, to retreat back into the safety of her routine. But the look in the lady's eyes wasn't pressure. It was belief. I'll think about it," Amira said, which was more than she would have dared a month ago. Outside the walls of the mansion, her story was beginning to take on a life of its own. One of the guests from the charity night had posted a short video. Online, a few shaky seconds of her singing. The caption read, "An unexpected voice stole the night." Within days, it had been shared dozens of times. People she had never met were commenting things like, "Who is she?" And that voice is pure feeling. She didn't know much about the internet. But the chef showed her the video on his phone. Amira watched herself, hearing the song as if for the first time. It was strange. She didn't cringe or look away. She felt proud. Her work in the house didn't change. There were still floors to sweep, clothes to fold, windows to clean. But now, in the middle of all that, little moments of connection bloomed. The family's guests sometimes asked if she would sing just a little. The youngest child often followed her around, asking when her next show would be. One afternoon, as she carried a tray into the sitting room, a man she didn't recognize was there with the master of the house. He stood when he saw her. "You're the singer from the event," he said with a smile. "I've been looking for you. I manage local performances. If you're interested, we should talk." The words sent a flicker of excitement through her, and fear too. She wasn't sure she was ready for anything bigger, but just knowing someone thought she could be was enough to make her day feel lighter. At night, in her small apartment, she would sit by the window with a cup of tea. The city looked the same as it always had, the same lights, the same quiet hum of traffic, but her place in it no longer felt so small. She thought about the little girl who once sang in the fields. She thought about the maid who hummed quietly to herself so no one would hear. And she thought about the woman who had stood on that stage, her voice filling the room. It was all the same person. She just hadn't realized it before. One evening, as she was leaving work, the youngest child ran to the gate to catch her. "You were amazing that night," the child said. "I told everyone at school about you," Amira laughed softly, crouching to meet the child's eyes. "And what did they say?" "They said you must be famous." The child replied with absolute seriousness. Amira smiled. "Not famous. Just a little less invisible." That week, she agreed to sing at the Roberts dinner. It felt like stepping into cold water, a little shocking, but also refreshing. She knew now that these moments mattered, not because of applause or compliments, but because every time she sang, she reclaimed another piece of herself. And somewhere deep inside, she was starting to believe this wasn't the end of her story. It was the beginning of something much bigger than she had ever imagined. From shadows to spotlight, the evening at the Roberts house was nothing like the first event. It wasn't in a grand hall with chandeliers this time. It was an elegant private dinner in a warmly lit room. Only a dozen guests, all dressed in soft colors, sat around a long wooden table. Yet for Amira, the weight of the moment felt the same. She stood near the corner, holding a small glass of water. Her palms were damp. Her heart beat steady but heavy. The Roberts welcomed her warmly, but she could feel curious eyes studying her to them. She wasn't a maid tonight. She was the singer they'd heard about. When the time came, a hush settled over the table. The host introduced her simply, a voice we were lucky to discover. Amira stepped forward, the familiar nerves tightening in her chest. She took a breath, remembering what she had told herself earlier in the mirror. "You're not here to impress. "You're here to share?" The first note left her lips and spread through the room. It was slower than her last performance. Softer, her song painted pictures of open skies, distant homes, and hearts finding their way back. By the time she reached the last line, several guests sat with still hands, eyes glassy with emotion. The applause was quiet, but heartfelt. A few people stood to shake her hand, thanking her for a song that felt like it came from somewhere real. It was the kind of praise that didn't feel like flattery. It felt honest. And for Amira, honesty was everything. After the dinner, the Roberts' niece approached her. "I work with a community center downtown," she explained. "We host open mic nights, mostly for local talent." "But I think you'd fit in perfectly," Amira hesitated. A community center meant strangers, no safety net of familiar faces. But the niece's expression was warm, her offer genuine. "Think about it," she said, pressing a small card. With an address into Amira's hand for days, the card stayed tucked in the pocket of her bag every time she reached for her keys. She felt it between her fingers. The thought of stepping onto another stage both frightened and thrilled her. Meanwhile, in the house where she still worked, her life had settled into a strange balance. She was still cleaning floors, polishing silver, folding linens. But now, people noticed her beyond the work. The family spoke to her more often. The guests sometimes asked about her next performance. It was as if the invisible walls that had once kept her in the background were quietly dissolving. The youngest child remained her biggest supporter. One afternoon, they dragged her into the sitting room. "Sing for me," they demanded, holding up a pretend microphone made from a wooden spoon. Amira laughed, shaking her head. But when the child pouted, she gave in, singing a playful tune just for them. The child clapped wildly, declaring, "You should be on TV." Amira laughed again, but the words planted another seed she couldn't ignore. 2 weeks later, she found herself at the community center. It wasn't planned. She had been walking home when she realized she was only a few blocks away. Her feet moved before her mind could stop them. Inside, the air smelled faintly of coffee and old books. The stage was small. Just a single microphone under a soft spotlight. She almost turned around. But then she saw the Roberts' niece, who spotted her and waved like they were old friends. "I'm glad you came," she said. "You don't have to sing if you're not ready. Just watch." Amira sat in the back and listened as young musicians, poets, and storytellers took turns on the stage. Each performance was imperfect but full of heart. It reminded her of her village gatherings, the way people shared without fear of not being good enough. By the end of the night, she felt lighter. When the niece asked if she wanted to try next week, Amira surprised herself by saying yes. Her first performance there was nothing fancy. No formal dress, no high heels. She sang a song from her childhood, one that had never been written down. The small crowd listened quietly, nodding along. When she finished, the applause wasn't loud, but it felt genuine. It wasn't about being impressive. It was about connection. Afterward, a young man from the audience told her, "That reminded me of my grandmother's singing." "Thank you." That single sentence stayed with her longer than all the applause she had received. In the weeks that followed, she began performing there regularly. She still worked at the mansion during the day, but at night, she had a different life. She was no longer just a maid who sang once at a charity event. She was becoming a voice people remembered. Yet through it all, she stayed humble. When asked about her sudden recognition, she always said, "I'm just glad I can share something." And deep down, she meant it, because for her, this wasn't about fame. It was about finally stepping out of the shadows and learning to live in the light. The last performance at the mansion, the invitation came quietly. Almost casually, the lady of the house found Amira in the garden one afternoon, trimming the roses. "We're hosting a small farewell dinner for a family friend next week," she said. "Would mean a lot if you could sing for us again." Amira looked up from her work, the sunlight catching her face. She hadn't performed at the mansion since that first night months ago. In that time, so much had changed. Her performances at the community center, her growing confidence, the way people now greeted her by name. And yet this house, this was where her voice had first stepped out of the shadows. "I'd be honored," she replied softly. And she meant it. The week passed quickly, by the day of the dinner. The mansion was dressed in soft golden light, candles flickering along. The long dining table, it wasn't a grand event like the charity night. No photographers, no long speeches, just a gathering of people who knew each other well, sharing a final evening together. Amira wore a simple navy dress. Not the uniform she used to wear while cleaning the same rooms she now stood in. Her hands didn't tremble. As they once had, she knew why she was here, and she no longer doubted she belonged. As the evening went on, she moved between the kitchen and the dining room, helping the staff with trays of food. But this time, she wasn't invisible in the background. Guests stopped her to ask how she'd been, to mention hearing about her performances. Some even joked that she was the mansion's hidden treasure. When dessert plates were cleared, the lady of the house rose from her seat and smiled warmly. "Before the night ends," she said, "to the room, I'd like us to hear a voice that has become very dear to this home." She turned toward Amira. "Will you sing for us?" Amira stepped forward, her heart steady. The familiar warmth of the room washed over her, but this time, there was no fear. She held the microphone gently, looking at the faces around her, faces that once looked past her, now watching with anticipation. The song she chose wasn't grand or dramatic. It was a simple, heartfelt melody about finding a place where you belong. Her voice carried through the room, rich and full. There was no strain, no hesitation, just the quiet certainty of someone who had learned to speak without words. As she sang, her eyes swept across the room. She saw the youngest child leaning forward in their chair. Smiling, she saw the chef in the doorway. Arms crossed but eyes soft, she saw the lady of the house. Her gaze filled with something beyond pride. It was gratitude. When the final note faded, there was a moment of stillness. And then applause, warm and unhurried. It wasn't the loud roar of the charity night. It was something gentler, more personal, the kind of applause that said, "We know you now," after the guests began to leave. Amira found herself alone in the study. The lady of the house entered quietly, carrying 2 cups of tea. They sat across from each other, the soft light making the moment feel like it belonged in another time. "You've grown so much since that first night," the lady said. "You've given me opportunities I never imagined," Amira replied. "And you saw me when no one else did." The lady shook her head. "No, you were always here. We just weren't looking closely enough." Later that night, as Amira stepped out of the mansion's front door, she paused. The air was cool, the moonlight stretching across the garden she had once only passed by on her way home. She looked back at the tall windows glowing from within. This place had once been the setting for her invisibility now. It was part of her story, the place where she had been given the first chance to be heard. She walked away with a sense of quiet closure. Not because she was leaving forever, she would still visit, still sing here from time to time. But because she no longer needed this house to remind her she had a voice. Her voice was hers now, and it would carry wherever she chose to go in the weeks that followed. Amira's performances at the community center grew more frequent. Other invitations came in, small weddings, private gatherings, local events. Each time she sang, she carried a piece of that first night with her, a reminder that sometimes it only takes one moment for the world to finally see you. And as she stood on those stages, whether big or small, she often thought about the mansion, the lady of the house, and the child who had once told her she sounded nice. It was a chain of small kindnesses that had led her here. Kindnesses that had turned the woman nobody saw into the woman no one could forget. The epilogue: the months rolled forward quietly, seasons shifted, leaves turned and fell, and the city streets changed their colors. Amira's life was no longer the silent loop it had been for years. Her days still began with simple routines, sweeping floors, boiling water for tea, folding linen, but now, those routines were not the sum of her life. She had stages now. Sometimes they were small, like the corner of a community center, or the back room of a cafe. Sometimes larger, like a garden wedding under twinkling lights. No matter the size, she sang with the same heart. Every note was a thread, stitching her past and present into something whole. The mansion remained part of her world. She still visited, still worked there occasionally. But her role had changed in everyone's eyes, to the family. She was no longer the maid. She was a friend, a voice, a part of their history. Guests who had once walked past her without a glance now greeted her with warmth, asking when they might hear her again. One evening, she stopped by to deliver flowers to the lady of the house. They sat in the study for a while, talking over tea. "You've become quite busy," the lady said with a smile. "I almost have to book you weeks in advance." Amira laughed softly, shaking her head. "It still feels strange sometimes, like this life isn't mine. It's always been yours," the lady replied. "You just had to find it." Her name had started appearing on small flyers around the neighborhood. Community night, featuring Amira. A few people began recognizing her in shops once. As she was buying fruit, a woman touched her arm and said, "Your song made me call my sister after 10 years. Thank you." Moments like that reminded Amira that her voice was more than entertainment, it was connection. And connection was something she had lived without for far too long. At the community center, she became something of a mentor. Young singers would ask her for advice, expecting tips about breathing or pitch. But she always told them the same thing: sing like you're talking to one person who needs to hear you. Because she knew that was where the magic lived, not in perfection, but in honesty. One night, after performing a slow, tender song about home, she stepped off stage and found the Roberts' niece waiting for her. "You've changed this place," she said. "People come not just to perform, but to listen, because you showed them what listening feels like." Amira felt her throat tighten. She hadn't thought of herself as someone who could change a place, but perhaps, quietly she had. The youngest child from the mansion grew taller, but never stopped visiting her performances. Sometimes they'd sit in the front row, mouthing the words to her songs. Other times they'd run up afterward, insisting she'd sing something happy next time. Amira treasured those visits more than she could explain. They were a reminder of the day everything began, when a child had simply said, "You sound nice," and unknowingly lit the spark. One late autumn evening, she stood backstage at a local festival. The air was crisp, and the crowd outside buzzed with conversation. She could see the soft glow of lanterns strung above the stage. When the announcer called her name, she stepped forward to the mic. She could feel the cool night air on her skin, the weight of eyes waiting for her to begin. She smiled, not nervously, but with the quiet confidence of someone who knew why. She was here. She began to sing. The song flowed easily, carrying pieces of her journey, the loneliness, the fear, the first note that had broken her silence. As her voice rose, she caught glimpses in the crowd of faces smiling, eyes softening, hands resting still to listen. For a moment, she thought about the version of herself who had once walked through crowded rooms unseen, the woman who had hidden her voice because she believed it didn't belong, and she wished she could tell that woman, "You were never invisible, you just hadn't been found yet." When the final note drifted away, the applause came like a gentle wave. She bowed her head, feeling warmth spread through her chest. It wasn't the size of the crowd or the loudness of the clapping that mattered. It was knowing that somewhere, in that audience, someone had felt seen the way she once longed to feel that night, as she walked home under the streetlights. She passed by the mansion. The windows glowed softly. She paused for just a moment, smiling to herself. She didn't need to go inside to know that part of her story was safe there, not the story of a maid, but of a woman who had been given a chance to be heard. She turned and kept walking, her steps light. The air was cold, but she felt warm, because she knew something for certain now: her voice would carry, no matter where she went, and she would never be invisible again.